developing brain, we're going to start out with some major brain terminology. I know that not everybody has taken biopsychology or human neuropsychology, and so I want to make sure we all start out with knowing the basics of the brain and the cells and the chemicals involved in the brain, just so that everyone has a foundation. We're going to talk about the structure, some components of the brain. The brainstem and the limbic system are both very important when it comes to waking and sleeping, so we're going to talk about those a little bit. And then we're going to look at the kinds of activities that we see in the brain, looking at the differences between when you are awake versus when you're in REM, or rapid eye movement, versus non-REM sleep. Then we're going to discuss the REM on, REM off cells, the VLPO, which is the ventrolateral preoptic nucleus, and we're going to finish out with a research study that looks at brain activity that is a really interesting support for what goes on while we're dreaming, and also discounts another theory for dreaming, which we will get to later. So just to start out, many of you have probably seen this image before. This is something that you guys should have seen in Introduction to Psychology. This is just a very basic kind of outlay of a neuron. This is one that we tend to do when we're teaching just because it's the easiest to kind of see, but not all neurons look like this. But just so that you guys know kind of the structure. So we have out here this structure right here is the cell body. In this particular kind of neuron or brain cell or nerve cell. And then we have the nucleus, which is housing the DNA and important structures inside of the cell, as well as important for making sure that this cell has its nutrients to be able to live. On the outer portion of the cell body or the soma, you see these branch-like structures, which are called dendrites. These are the receiving end, so you would have another neuron over here with its dendrites and its axon, which we'll get to in just a minute, connecting to another neuron. So this right here, these dendrites, are the receiving end of the cell. Here you can see these like little bumps right here. These are dendritic spines. What it does is it increases the surface area of the receiving end so that it can make more connections. Obviously, if you can have cells that are interconnected, then that can speed up transmission of information and, of course, mean that you have a network of cells in your brain that can communicate to one another. Here we have the axon, which goes all the way down here. The axon is covered in myelin sheath. The myelin sheath are made up of a fatty substance that really works to increase conductivity along the cell. Now, as information or as a impulse travels through the cell, it's what we refer to as an electrical impulse, and so we need this to be insulated so that we can have a fast message sent from the starting point of the cell to the end. And here we have at the bottom, at the end of the axon, we have these terminal buttons or boutons, and this is the quote-unquote connector part to the next receiving cell, so the dendrites of another cell. They don't actually physically connect. There's a tiny little space, which we'll get to here in a minute, that is in between the cells. Now, when it comes to the transmission within a neuron, like I said before, this is an electrical impulse, and it travels from this portion here through the axon hillock all the way down to the terminal bouton or button. So it moves through the axon hillock, which is right here. This is the axon hillock, okay? And then it moves through the neuron. When we talk about the actual electrical transmission, this is what we refer to as the action potential. or the neuron is firing. And this is the electrical impulse that goes from one point to the next. And of course, it follows a rule of all or none. Either it fires or it doesn't. There's no sort of firing, kind of firing. Either the neuron has the electrical impulse or not. The transmission between neurons, so from neuron to neuron, is chemical. And these chemicals that we have in our brain are, that's what we're seeing that are involved with wake, sleep, REM sleep, non-REM sleep. And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about mostly in this lecture, is the actual chemicals. These chemicals, or neurotransmitters in the brain, are released in what's called the synaptic cleft. They are sent from neuron to relay information about what the next neuron should do. Should it release chemicals? Should it not release chemicals? Should it increase firing? Should it stop firing? All these different messages get sent from cell to cell. Now, here, if we look at this cell, and we talked about the terminal bouton, it contains a synaptic cleft that connects to another neuron. And that particular area is, of course, the spot that the chemicals get sent through, and it's received by what we call the postsynaptic neuron. So here we have a cell that has several connections to another cell, and these are little gaps are called synaptic clefts, and the chemical gets sent. This is the sending cell will get sent to the receiving end here. So we have, this is the sending cell sending the chemicals to the, in this case, this blue cell is the receiving end. Here's a close-up look of the synapse. So this is the terminal bouton, the sending neuron, and then here we have the receiving neuron here. Okay, so we have the presynaptic membrane and the postsynaptic membrane. And so what we're doing here is essentially sending that chemical information from one cell to the next. So the synaptic cleft is this small gap between neurons. It's inside the terminal bouton, or the presynaptic membrane, contains little pockets. These are called vesicles. These little pockets here contain the chemicals to transmit from one cell to the next. The cleft is the actual physical space where the chemicals will be released. And of course, that chemical can be taken by the postsynaptic cell. It can dissolve into this cleft spot. It can kind of move out of the cleft and get sort of dissolved into nothingness. It can also be sucked back up into the presynaptic cell. These are all different things that can happen to the chemical, but we're primarily going to talk about it being taken in to the postsynaptic cell through the use of receptors. The receptors are like think of the neurotransmitters and receptors as lock and key. So on the postsynaptic membrane, there are little receptor locks. Okay, so they kind of have a specific chemical structure binding potential. And then these chemicals that get sent through look like keys, where they have a particular chemical structure that can only bind to the receptors that are sort of made for it, that are defined for it. So in this case, these receptor sites have to match up with the specific chemical structure in order to do something. Open, close, shut the message down, increase the chemical, whatever it might do. Now that we've kind of established a foundation of what the brain, very, very on a sort of microcellular sort of way, what the brain can do, we're going to talk about some of the important chemicals that are important for being awake. So we're going to talk about acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and glutamates. Norepinephrine is also referred to as noradrenaline. So these three particular neurotransmitters are important for waking. Now, what you're going to notice is that many neurotransmitters have multiple jobs. So just because you have acetylcholine doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't do other things. It's just important for, in this case, we're going to talk about waking, but it's also important for other things related to your muscles. Remember that we only have so many specific chemicals in the brain. And in the case of neurotransmitters, we've identified about 50 that have some role or another in the brain. And sometimes the chemicals will have a specific role while you're awake, and then when you're asleep, that same chemical does a different job. So keep in mind that the chemicals in your brain aren't isolated. They're not in a vacuum. So if one particular chemical is being impacted, let's say you're taking a medication or something has gone wrong or imbalanced, the other chemicals are going to be impacted. And there's not just one particular pathway for one particular neurotransmitter. Many neurotransmitters have different pathways that work on different areas of the brain, where it might work as an excitatory element in one area and pathway in the brain, meaning that it amps up activity and it increases the amount of chemicals. In another part of the brain, that same chemical might actually work as an inhibitory chemical, meaning that it might block something or stop an action. Think of the brain like a pond, and think of the chemicals like the water. And if you drop a pebble into a pond, you're going to see ripple effect. You're going to see it's going to impact the acute area, and then it's going to ripple out and go maybe several feet, depending on how big the pebble was. The brain and the chemicals are the same kind of idea. If you impact one particular neurotransmitter at one particular site or area or pathway, it's going to have an overarching effect on not only that same neurotransmitter, but other ones as well. So let's talk about the individual chemicals here. So acetylcholine is very important for arousal, and the projections and the receptors are very far-reaching. They're all over the cerebral cortex, which is a very large surface area of the brain, and it's very important. Acetylcholine is very important for attention. Now, norepinephrine also has projections that are widespread across the brain, and we find that the neurons with receptors for norepinephrine, so we call them norepinephrinergic neurons, they fire at a higher rate when we're awake. They're really important for things like vigilance and arousal. It gets us amped up. So when you have more norepinephrine, you're going to see a higher arousal. Glutamate is also important for arousal, and it is very important in sleep as well. So it's important for the brain waves that are associated with slow wave sleep, stages 3 and 4 sleep, those really large brain waves, the delta waves that we see in those particular stages. Histamine and orexin are also important for waking. Now, orexin is a hypothalamic neuropeptide, and I'm going to get to this in just a minute, but it's important to know that orexin is actually known by two different names. But let's talk about histamine first. So one really easy way to remember that histamine is associated with waking is that when you take an antihistamine, like if you take an allergy medication, a lot of times it makes people sleepy. So like if you take Benadryl, if you take something that's going to help with allergies and an allergic reaction, that medication tends to make people drowsy. Well, remember, an antihistamine blocks histamine. And so if it's making you drowsy because it's blocking histamine, then histamine is what makes you feel wakeful. We find that those histamine cells project to acetylcholinergic cells, and that's how it works to increase arousal. So remember that these neurotransmitters sometimes play together to enhance an effect, and sometimes they play against each other, and they might minimize an effect. Now, orexin is, like I said, it is a hypothalamic neuropeptide. Now, orexin is also known by another name, and that is hypocretin. So the interesting thing is that when researchers were studying this particular neuropeptide, there were actually two groups that were studying the same neuropeptide at the same time, and they didn't realize that they were both looking at the same thing. So one group called it orexin, and one group called it hypocretin. One group was looking at it for looking at sleep, and the other group was looking at eating behavior and how it impacts hunger. What orexin does is really important in this role of switching between sleep states and wakefulness and sleep, and it's also important for appetite. So these two different groups that were studying it were looking at it for those both those particular things. And so we know it's important for many things, and whatever you refer to it as, whether it's orexin or hypocretin, it doesn't matter. It's the same exact neuropeptide. We're going to talk about orexin later when we talk about sleep disorders, and specifically in narcolepsy. So narcolepsy is, there are certain types of narcolepsy where we find are actually caused by a virus that wipes out those orexinergic cells. And so we only have about 7,000 of these neurons that have receptors for orexin. Even though there's widespread projection, the specific area with the orexinergic neurons are actually very limited when you consider how many neurons and how many neurotransmitters that we have and receptors that we have. So we have a very limited number of these particular neurons, and if they are depleted, then that means that we are going to experience the symptoms of narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is when you have this sudden, very strong urge to fall asleep, and you tend to fall asleep all throughout the day at any given time. So remember, orexin is important for waking, and when those neurons are depleted, that's when you see diseases and disorders like narcolepsy, where the person cannot actually stay awake. They have lost those neurons that are keeping them in the wakeful state. The specific effect that we see orexin having is excitatory, in the essence of keeping somebody in a wakeful state. Now, when it comes to non-REM sleep, three important neurotransmitters are serotonin, GABA, and glutamate. And we're going to see, of course, serotonin, GABA, and glutamate being important for other particular things, like serotonin is important for mood. So what serotonin can do is it helps to dampen the brain's response to sensory inputs, which helps with sleep onset. Now, none of these neurotransmitters are alone responsible for sleep, or non-REM sleep specifically. Serotonin is helpful for, non-REM sleep is the stages 1 through 4, okay? Stage 1 is where we see sleep start to happen, right? You start to feel drowsy and sleepy. Serotonin is important for this. It's not the only neurotransmitter, but it is one that we see as important for that process. Now, tryptophan, which is the sort of manufacturing step to get to serotonin, can help mildly facilitate sleep onset. Now, tryptophan is found in turkey, and a lot of people say, oh, well, during Thanksgiving, when I eat an absurd amount of turkey, it has tryptophan in it, and that's what causes me to fall asleep. We've found that, yes, in theory, this is possible, but you would have to eat way too much turkey to have the tryptophan impact you the way that we think it does. What's really going on is that you've eaten a large meal, that makes us sleepy, you're probably not really doing a whole lot, and that's the reason why we always want to nap on Thanksgiving, more so than the amount of tryptophan. But remember that tryptophan manufactures serotonin, and both are involved with this sleep onset and feeling drowsy. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, it's known as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, and it's important for reducing arousal and dampening the neural activity to quiet the brain to help with sleep onset. It's very important in producing sleep spindles and delta waves, which we've talked about in other lectures. Glutamate is also important for sleep spindles and also important for the process of those delta waves that we see in slow wave sleep. Now, another neurotransmitter or another chemical important for non-REM sleep is adenosine. Now, adenosine is important in an easy way to remember this is actually thinking about caffeine. So adenosine is a neuromodulator, and it helps to inhibit neural activity. It helps make us sleepy. It quiets the brain. Caffeine, when we consume a cup of coffee or if we drink an energy drink, it interacts with adenosine in a way that it blocks it out. It weakens its impact. And so when we consume caffeine and we want to feel awake, okay, that's going to help dampen the adenosine's effect. Your brain will actually overcompensate by creating more adenosine receptors. And so that's one reason why if you drink a cup of coffee and you drink the same cup of coffee every single day, you might get used to the effects. And as you start to feel sleepy, because you are drinking the same cup of coffee amount every day, your brain is compensated by replenishing those adenosine receptors. So then you can counteract this by drinking more coffee. And so that's going to lead your brain to create even more adenosine receptors. And so you're just kind of going in a circle, consuming more and more caffeine to counteract the effect of adenosine, or counteract the effects of your brain's compensating with creating more adenosine receptors. So that's one element that kind of comes into play here. So if you can remember that drinking caffeine, okay, weakens adenosine. Adenosine is important for making us feel sleepy. Now, another way that this works is looking at glycogen. So glycogen depletes as we are awake throughout the day. So the falling levels of glycogen actually trigger an effect of adenosine's release. And so as you have this depletion of glycogen, that's signaling more and more adenosine to be released, which will then promote sleep. So as the adenosine builds up, then you are going to start feeling sleepier and sleepier, okay? And so not only do you have this particular amount or level at sleep onset, what we found is a relationship between the amount of adenosine and the amount of slow wave sleep and delta waves that we see during stages 3 and 4 sleep. So as you sleep throughout the night, the adenosine levels are going to progressively reduce. And so if adenosine is promoting sleep and you're getting less and less amount of adenosine throughout the night because you're depleting it, then that's going to promote wakefulness and lead to you lead to the process of you waking up. Now, there's some other key substances that are important for this process. So there are particular other neuromodulators, other peptides. Somatostatin, for example, is important for non-REM sleep. We also see that there are other blood substances like interleukins that are related to inflammation. Those are important for non-REM sleep. Growth hormone, prolactin are all related to feeling drowsy, feeling sleepy, and sleep onset. Now, when it comes to REM sleep, we have acetylcholine, glycine, norepinephrine, serotonin. Remember, a lot of these were actually important for wakefulness. So these are the same neurotransmitters. We're just seeing them do different things in different types of sleep. So in REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, acetylcholine is important for the production of this type of sleep. Glycine is known as an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This is important for us to experience that muscle paralysis that we see during REM sleep. Now remember, it's really important that we have our muscles paralyzed during REM sleep so that we're not acting out our dreams. Now we tend to see REM sleep as the sleep that we're in, the type of sleep that we're in when we're experiencing dreams. You don't want somebody to get up and move around while they're dreaming. So if the muscles no longer have input in and output out, then that's going to create a safe environment for us to be able to sleep and dream. So glycine is important to inhibit those muscle contractions so that we can experience dreams during REM sleep. Now, norepinephrine and serotonin are both important for turning off REM sleep so that we can cycle through the different types and stages, and also leads us to wakefulness. Now, this is just a very general, overview of the brain so that everybody is aware of the kinds of structures in the brain. So the cerebral cortex is this sort of outer portion of the brain, and contains these grooves here where we see the sulci or sulcus. This is sulcus here, or solstice, and then sulci, which is the plural version of that. Fissures are the really large grooves, so these right here. These are much easier to locate on a brain, and you can actually use it to help you kind of navigate where you are. So there's a fissure, and then these gyri are these bulges. So these sections here, those are gyri, or a gyrus being a singular one. And this is the major structure of the brain. We have gray matter and we have white matter. The gray matter is made up of cell bodies, whereas the white matter is made up of axons. Now, a good way to remember this is that, so these cell bodies here. So the cell bodies, so think of the brain kind of like where we have these cell bodies all making up, trillions of these, right? Making up the tissue. And then we have these projections, these axons here. Now the axons are made up of fat, right? Because it's myelin sheaths. Now the fat in a human brain looks white, okay? And so this is the reason why we call it white matter, is because it actually looks white. And so because the axons are made up of fat, this looks white. So white matter is made up of those fatty axons. Gray matter is the cell body's outer portions here. And the reason why we call it gray matter is because it has a kind of a pinkish grayish look. And that is what makes up the outer tissue. Now the corpus callosum, so we have two hemispheres. So there's another hemisphere over here in the brain, and it's connected with a structure kind of in the middle, and that is the corpus callosum, and that's important for connecting the two hemispheres so they can communicate back and forth. And you want to make sure that they're able to communicate so that you can get the proper connectivity and communication from one side to the next. And then the four major lobes of the brain, and this is a very these are major structures. We have the frontal lobe, so your eyeball would be like here, right? Your ear would be like ish over here. It's a very strange looking ear, but you get me. So this right here, the frontal lobe is blue, contains the motor cortex, also called the frontal association area. The top of your brain is the parietal lobe. It's important for things like speech. Also contains the somatosensory cortex, which is on the edge of the motor cortex. The very back of your brain here is the occipital lobe. This right here is actually important for connects to the eye. and is important for things like vision and the visual association area. If you ever smack the back of your head and see stars, that's because the input and output to the eyes has been disrupted. The final part here is the temporal lobe, and this is over the ear. This is important for things like hearing, auditory, and also referred to as the auditory association area. These are some major structures in the brain. Remember, you have two hemispheres. The cerebellum is in the back of your brain, important for things like balance and fine motor movement. What you have here is the skull area, and then your meninges that help to cushion the brain. And then what's really important that we're going to discuss is the brain stem. And that is definitely an area that we know is important for sleep and wakefulness, and you don't want to damage this, because this is something that you would see, of course, leading to somebody not being able to wake up, for example, from a coma. So the important structures of the brain stem, the medulla, for example, the pons are located here. The midbrain reticular formation is not really a structure. Is this kind of green area here. We're going to talk about the reticular formation later in the slides. Very important quote-unquote structure here, but it's not actually something that you can locate on an actual brain. It's more of like just a portion of the brain. And then, of course, the raphe nucleus and all that. And we're going to get more into that. I'm going to do a different slideshow, moving on from the limbic system. This is the last thing I'm going to do. And then the rest of this will get into specific structures for sleep and wakefulness. So the last thing I do want to cover is the limbic system. Many of you have probably heard of this. Because it is made up of so many different structures, like the limbic cortex, the hippocampus is important for memory. The amygdala is important for emotion and, for example, fear. Hypothalamus is important for things like regulating temperature. And also we find the suprachiasmatic nucleus, that's a specific nucleus in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is actually made up of a lot of different nuclei. And then it's specific portions of the frontal cortex. Now, these all essentially work together. All of these work together as the limbic system to help us with motivation, help us with emotion and memory. They are structures that work together and are necessary for each other. So if you think about specific memories that are important to you, they likely have an emotional aspect to them. All of that works together to form the limbic system. So the next slideshow, the next slides series are going to go over specifically waking, REM sleep and non-REM sleep, and we will cover that in another lecture. If you have any questions on these slides, please feel free to email me.